Hi, come in. Hi, just trying to re-shelve things. It's amazing. Here's my beautiful Keats Eve of St Agnes. We'll have to read that on the Eve of St Agnes. We'll put it in here with the precious books. So lovely to see you again as we continue in a slightly more Christmassy spirit. Come over here. Let me show you these shelves, rather obscured by everything. All of along here are basically two writers whom I really admire and draw from, GK Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc, who were great friends. So there's The Hedge and the Horse by Hilaire Belloc and The Flying Inn by GK Chesterton. I always reread GK Chesterton around Christmas time because he's just he writes about Christmas incredibly well. Of course, his view is that Dickens writes best about Christmas, and he reckons almost all Dickens books are really Christmas books. Anyway, let me read you a favourite. I love this. He wrote little columns for journals all over the place, and they were so good that rather than just turning them, into yesterday's news as tomorrow's fish and chip papers, they were all collected into books. And this particular series, the Minerva editions of modern authors, this is before paperbacks were invented, but they were beautifully done, and they were affordable. And I bought this not long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, perhaps, for £5. It's beautiful. It fits in your pocket, and it's a great collection of Chesterton's works. So let me read you. If you make yourself comfortable, and pour yourself a drink. I'll raise a Christmas glass to you as well. And let me read to you this wonderful little story called The Shop of Ghosts. A Good Dream. Nearly all the best and most precious things in the universe you can get for a halfpenny. I make an exception, of course, of the sun, the moon, the earth, people, stars, thunderstorms and such trifles. You can get them for nothing. But the general principle will be at once apparent. In the street behind me, for instance, you can now get a ride on an electric tram for a halfpenny. To be on an electric tram is to be in a flying castle in a fairy tale. And you can get quite a large number of brightly coloured sweets for a halfpenny. But if you want to see what a vast and bewildering array of valuable things you can get at a halfpenny each, you should do as I was doing last night. I was gluing my nose against the glass of a very small and dimly lit toy shop in one of the greyest and leanest of the streets of Battersea. But dim as was that square of light, it was filled, as a child once said to me, with all the colours God ever made. Those toys of the poor were like the children who buy them. They were all dirty, but they were all bright. For my part, I think brightness more important than cleanliness, since the first is of the soul and the second of the body. You must excuse me, I'm a Democrat. I know I'm out of fashion in the modern world. As I looked at that palace of pygmy wonders, at small green omnibuses, at small blue elephants, at small black dolls, and small red Noah's Arks, I must have fallen into some sort of unnatural trance. That lit shop window became like the brilliantly lit stage when one is watching some highly coloured comedy. I forgot the grey houses and the grimy people behind me, as one forgets the dark galleries and the dim crowds at a theatre. It seemed as if the little objects behind the glass were small, not because they were toys, but because they were objects far away. The green omnibus was really a green omnibus, a green Bayswater omnibus, passing across some huge desert on its ordinary way to Bayswater. The blue elephant was no longer blue with paint. He was blue with distance. The red Noah's Ark was really the enormous ship of earthly salvation, riding on the rain-swollen sea, red in the first morning of hope. To shake off this dangerous and dreamy sense, I went into the shop and tried to buy wooden soldiers. The man in the shop was very old and broken, with confused white hair covering his head and half his face, hair so startlingly white it looked almost artificial. Yet though he was senile and even sick, there was nothing of suffering in his eyes. He looked rather as if he were gradually falling asleep in a not unkindly decay. He gave me the wooden soldiers, but when I put the money down, he did not at first seem to see it. Then he blinked at it feebly, and then he pushed it feebly away. "No, no," he said vaguely. I never have. We're very old-fashioned here." "Not taking money," I replied, "seems to me more like an uncommonly new fashion than an old one." "I never have," said the old man, blinking and blowing his nose. "I've always given presents. I'm too old to stop." "Good heavens," I said. "What can you mean? Why, you might be Father Christmas." "Well, I am Father Christmas," he said apologetically, and blew his nose again. The lamps could not have been lighted yet in the street outside. At any rate, I could see nothing against the darkness but the shining shop window. There were no sounds of steps or voices in the streets. I might have strayed into some new and sunless world, but something had cut the cords of common sense, and I could not feel even surprise except sleepily. Something made me say, "You look ill, Father Christmas." "I'm dying," he said. I did not speak. It was he who spoke again. "All the new people have left my shop. I cannot understand it. They seem to object to me on such curious and inconsistent sorts of grounds, these scientific men, these innovators. They say that I give people superstitions and make them too visionary. And then they say I give people sausages and make them too coarse. They say my heavenly parts are too heavenly, and they say my earthly parts are too earthly. I don't know what they want, I'm sure. How can heavenly things be too heavenly, or earthly things be too earthly? How can one be too good or too jolly? I don't understand. But I understand one thing well enough. These modern people are living, and I'm dead." "You may be dead," I replied. "You ought to know. But as for what they're doing, don't call it living." A silence fell suddenly between us, which I somehow expected to be unbroken. But it had not fallen for more than a few seconds when, in the utter stillness, I distinctly heard a very rapid step coming nearer and nearer along the street. The next moment, a figure flung itself into the shop and stood framed in the doorway. He wore a large white hat, tilted back as if in patience. He had tight, bright, old-fashioned pantaloons, a gaudy, old-fashioned stock and waistcoat, and an old, fantastic coat. He had large, wide-open, luminous eyes like those of an arresting actor. He had a fiery, nervous face and a fringe of beard. He took in the shop and the old man in a look that seemed literally a flash, and uttered the exclamation of a man utterly staggered. "Good Lord!" he cried out. "It can't be you. It isn't you. I came to ask where your grave was." "I'm not dead yet, Mr. Dickens," said the old gentleman with a feeble smile. "But I'm dying," he hastened to add reassuringly. "But dash it all, you were dying in my time," said Mr. Charles Dickens with animation. "And you don't look a day older." "I've felt like this for a long time," said Father Christmas. Mr. Dickens turned his back and put his head out the door into the darkness. "Dick!" he roared at the top of his voice. "He's still alive!" Another shadow darkened the doorway, and a much larger and more full-blooded gentleman in an enormous periwig came in, fanning his flushed face with a military hat of the cut of Queen Anne. He carried his head well back like a soldier, and his hot face had even a look of arrogance, which was suddenly contradicted by his eyes, which were literally as humble as a dog's. His sword made a great clatter, as if the shop were too small for it. "Indeed," said Sir Richard Steele, "'tis a most prodigious matter, for the man was dying when we wrote about Sir Roger de Coverley and his Christmas Day." My senses were growing dimmer, and the room darker. It seemed to be filled with newcomers. "It hath ever been understood," said a burly man who carried his head humorously and obstinately a little on one side. I think he was Ben Jonson. "It hath ever been understood, Consular Jacobo, under our King James and her late Majesty, that such good and hearty customs were fallen sick and like to pass from the world. This greybeard, most surely, was no lustier when I knew him than now. And I also thought I heard a green-clad man like Robin Hood say in some mixed Norman French, but I saw the man dying." "I've felt like this for a long time," said Father Christmas in his feeble way again. Mr. Charles Dickens suddenly leant across to him. "Since when?" "Since you were born." "Yes," said the old man, and sank shaking into a chair. "I have been always dying." Mr. Dickens took off his hat with a flourish, like a man calling a mob to rise. "I understand it now," he cried. "You will never die." I love that story. I just love the idea that every generation will say, "Oh dear, the poor old Christmas customs are on their way out," and lo and behold, they flourish again. "I understand it now," said Mr. Dickens. "You will never die." I hope you enjoyed that as a little taste of GK Chesterton from Tremendous Trifles. Speaking of trifles, I hope there's going to be some trifles on the Christmas fair at some point in the next few days. I am, as Shakespeare says, a snapper up of unconsidered trifles. Have a good Christmas.